Test. Test, 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 test. Hello? Is my mic on? Hello? I can hear me too.
I can hear us.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Good. Well, we'll hear you. Hopefully when everybody quiets down a little bit.
I do. Yeah.
I was like, I'm gonna need paperwork.
Oh, that's good.
Because I will, jeez. I will definitely, like.
And their souls, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know you were miserable.
I did that, yeah. No, I was being really, yeah. But I mean, yeah, I'm sure you've got still talented. Oftentimes it's the younger faculty who are going to help you.
I'm going to have you use this to do the intro. I mean, you can stand up here if you want, or you can stand wherever. I'll just stand here. Okay. Go ahead. When you start talking, I'll be watching. So you may not hear yourself at first because I'm going to keep it down. Okay, yeah. Is he making fun of me again? My man! This free market stuff. Holy shit. I'll just let you all go at it. I was teasing. You know, I have told Steve how much I value who you are and what you are. I appreciate all you do. I would not try and disrupt anything. But I hit a point in my life where I want to respect the culture. I want to have an insight. Just getting ready to introduce speakers for our event today in about 5 minutes. I believe we got to 10 o'clock. I think they're right to 10. Well, where'd you need? Well, do you need mom? She's here right now. Okay. You'll be okay? Want me to call you when we get done? Sorry, I can't really get out of this since it's a shower. Love you.
Very long.
So are you in the law school?
Department of Justice in A.
Yeah. Just want to make sure, because they're almost the exact same thing. So make sure you get the right one. This is it, yeah. We're getting close to emptiness. So it's just great. Williamsburg is what it is. sounding, he was thinking it's the same thing. We do the PPE and the e-com. Yeah. Okay. So I guess we just got to figure that out. Right. Yeah, I'd be open to doing. I told him I'd be open to doing it like Wednesday night, because I'm already doing Monday nights. So like I wouldn't want to do Monday night, Tuesday night for this class, and then Wednesday at 4 for my other class. But I wouldn't mind doing this. It's only 5 minutes. But we'll talk. Yeah. You guys ready to rock and roll?
We'd love to do that. We can put the bridge down on the moat. Have them come over to visit school.
He's here right now.
No, you're teasing me about, God forbid we collaborate with someone. Giving it back.
It's in the red book. Sorry.
We're not allowed, right?
Professor Hardy.
Good afternoon. Whoa. And welcome to the first event for the John H. Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise. I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the center. And before I begin, I'm going to make a few announcements. If you're here as part of the Card Success Series, be sure to sign one of the registration sheets on the tables outside the auditorium as you leave. If you're here for extra credit from your class, pick up an extra credit card when you leave. These will be handed out when the program is over. We're having a movie night. We're going to watch Shawshank Redemption on Wednesday, February 7th at 5:30 in room 226. It's free, but you need to register. We're going to have pizza, popcorn, colas, and a little discussion about the economics behind Shawshank Redemption. So that's February 7th, 5:30. And finally, my bid to find economics majors has gotten a lot sweeter. Starting in the fall of 2018, Math 205 will no longer be the requirement to be an econ major. And so if you're already here at college, if that's the new book, it'll apply to you also. You still have to take Math 180, but you can take 205. But anyhow, so the pot has gotten sweeter. I think you guys should all major in econ. You get great jobs afterwards. All right, so enough of that. In 2015, the United States had the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2.2 million people in prison. This is an increase of 500% over the past 40 years. Although the numbers vary, according to the BBC report, we have 737 people in prison for every 100,000 population. Russia has 615, Ukraine 350, South Africa 334, Communist China 118. So, we're number one. This is great. Criminal justice reform has become a really hot topic. So this is what we're going to focus on this semester with the Schnatter Center programs. Besides today's event, we are going to have John Pfaff. He's the author of Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. He's going to talk about his book on Thursday, February 22nd, here in the auditorium at 4:30, again followed by free pizza. And then on Wednesday, March 28th, we're going to have another panel similar to this one, but they're going to talk about local criminal justice issues. And by the way, Kentucky incarcerates over 900 people per 100,000. So we're way above the U.S. average. So today, we're lucky to have a panel of experts on various aspects of criminal justice system. The panel will be moderated by Michael DeSavio, who will introduce the other panel members. Michael teaches in the Department of Justice Administration and the Department of Computer Engineering and Computer Science at University of Louisville on issues of law, society, and information assurance. His focus is on law and social sciences as they relate to computer engineering, evidence, and digital forensics. He holds a JD and BS in mathematics from Louisiana State University. And so he's a specialist in these areas, and I want to thank him for leading this panel, and he's going to introduce the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. First, I'd like to thank Stephen. This is a great honor because the Schnatter Center does a great deal of great things for the Commonwealth, even if the Commonwealth doesn't listen. I also want to thank the Dean for giving me a visa so I could come from the College of Arts and Sciences over to the College of Business and talk with you. And short-lived, I got it, he's watching. So, and I think that's part of the problem here. Criminal justice is a fundamental aspect of any government, of any people, of any society. So how we administer it, whether it's just or not, tells us what we are. But these also become fiscal and policy issues that we need to approach in a reasonable manner. As Steve just pointed out, Kentucky is very high in categories we shouldn't be. We're the 10th most populous prison state in the United States. We're 5th when it comes to the incarceration of women. Since 2010, 31 states have reduced their prison populations. Ours has increased in the past 5 years 8%. Every person incarcerated represents a lost worker. It represents a family with no father. It represents children with no one to watch out for them. So taking a realistic approach to what's actually happening, in the face of a lot of traditions which may be wrong, it's going to be critical to helping us. It's directly affecting each of you because the state's budget, and we spend almost $600 million a year on incarcerating people. The state's budget is going to be taking more money from the universities to pay for those costs. We are very fortunate to have an exceptional panel of people looking at these issues. And what's particularly important is that they are coming from outside the criminal justice discipline. They are political scientists and economists trying to take a data-driven approach to these issues. We first have Anna Harvey, who runs the police lab at NY University. She was a dean there. She holds her doctorate from Princeton University. Megan Stevenson is with the law school at George Mason University, but she's an economist with her doctorate from University of California, Berkeley, trying to get lawyers to think rationally. This is a challenge. This is a challenge. And we have Greg D'Angelo, also has his doctorate in economics from University of California, Santa Barbara, because he's a surfer dude. And he too will focus, they all focus on issues of how do we make a just and effective system of justice. So with that, I'd like them to, what we're going to do is they're going to give sort of brief openings on issues, and then we'll like your questions regarding how do we have an evidence-based approach to justice. So since he's farthest away and can't hit me, Greg D'Angelo, could you start, please?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm originally from upstate New York, near to Syracuse, and so I usually don't have good thoughts about Louisville because our basketball team usually comes here and gets our butts kicked. So it's nice to be here on a positive note, but thanks all for being here. I'm just going to focus a little bit on issues that you might not think about affecting criminal justice, but are probably having an effect on the system that you wouldn't have sort of maybe known in advance, or maybe you did, and if you did, that's great, and hopefully I'll bring a few other ideas to light for you, but I'm going to focus on kind of 4 quick things just to highlight, and then I'm happy to take any questions you guys might have, but namely on elections, and given that elections are kind of a hot topic in the United States, we'll just kind of briefly mention a little bit about the effect that they're having on the criminal justice system. How we compensate those that are in the legal system, not necessarily prisoners, but those are the actors that are influencing the criminal justice system, and how we compensate them, and maybe the effect that that's having on the legal system. Quickly talk about the pressures that the criminal justice system faces as its role of being a revenue generator, which many of us probably think about, but maybe don't think about the external pressures that are faced by that the legal system faces in being that revenue generator, and finally talk about some of the career incentives and legal changes that are occurring in the legal system and how they might all be affecting all of us. So again, having just been through probably one of the more tumultuous elections in our history in the United States, I think it merits considering the effect that these elections have on those that are within the criminal justice system. So while we're talking about criminal justice, I'm going to focus on a quick quote that from the state I currently live in West Virginia, from one of the Supreme Court of Appeals justices that was there, this guy Richard Neely, and I love the quote because it's so honest and it has such it cuts right to the core of one of the issues that the legal system faces. So the quote went like this. It says, "As long as I'm allowed to redistribute wealth from out-of-state companies to injured in-state plaintiffs, I shall continue to do so. Not only is my sleep enhanced when I give someone else's money away, but so is my job security, because the in-state plaintiff, their families, and their friends will reelect me." Right? It's so bold, it's so honest, right? It's this guy who's just, I'm a judge, right? And I don't care that I'm going to tell you that I care about that election. I care about getting reelected. And I'm going to do the things that are going to ensure that I get reelected. And that's troublesome. That can be troublesome anyway. It can be troublesome because we have this problem for many of our elections where you probably know a lot of the issues that the presidency is going to face, the presidency of the United States. But I'm guessing most of you probably don't know the name of a single judge in this county. You probably don't know the name of your district attorney, and almost certainly don't know the name of your assistant district attorneys in the county. But these are the people that are handing out justice in your county. Right? These are the people that are actually influencing whether or not somebody's civil liberties are taken away from them. And most of us don't know who these people are. And so we're going to lean, during election periods, we're going to lean on some signal, something that's going to tell us about who these people are. And a lot of times those are going to be the political parties that these individuals might be associated with. And there's some reason to perhaps be concerned about the effect that these political parties and their aims and their objectives that they might have on the actors that being judges and district attorneys within these parties. And we might want to be concerned with those. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that during election periods, justice is miscarried rather than actually carried out successfully. And so a lot of people will say maybe we should get rid of political parties altogether. But then I go back to how would you know, how could you discern who's a good candidate from a not so good candidate? So elections play a pretty profound effect. During election periods, we tend to see legal errors increase by 6 to 10%. Sending people to jail who shouldn't go to jail, 6 to 10% more than the 6 months outside of. So if we look at the 6 months prior to an election, that's when we see 6 to 10% higher errors going on. Which is a pretty big problem when you think about elections. They are influencing the criminal justice system, but in ways that are kind of silent. The second thing I'll discuss is the idea that so many people who run for offices, once they're elected, they promise that they're going to make these broad and sweeping changes. So, we're going to put new laws in place, and these new laws are going to be good. But a lot of people don't think about the fact that criminal justice requires somebody to be on the ground enacting that law and carrying out that law. And I work a ton with law enforcement agencies, and I do ride-alongs with police officers all the time. I'm constantly talking to these guys and women because I think they're fascinating individuals to talk to, and I want to know what incentives are affecting them. And when it comes to police officers, one of the things that I've learned, and I've kind of done some research in this space, is that they hate when laws change because they were trained under one set of laws, and now the laws have changed underneath them. And if I'm a junior police officer, if you've ever looked in your rearview mirror, how many of you have ever looked in your rearview mirror and you're like trying to gauge who's pulling you over? You're like, is it an old cop or is it a young cop? Am I getting a ticket or not, right? These are the sorts of things you might be concerned about. And as it turns out, some of that is well-founded. Junior cops don't like laws that recently changed because if they use that law to issue you a citation and they do that incorrectly, that gives some signal that maybe they're not so good at their job. That could have long-term effects on their career. Maybe they don't get promoted. So actually, when you talk about changing laws, which we talk about a lot, we want to make lots of changes. We want to, broad sweeping changes. That could be bad in some sense because maybe people won't carry out those laws because they themselves have a set of incentives that might misalign with the criminal justice system's objectives. So next thing I'll talk about just really quickly is compensation of legal actors. I'm yet to meet public servants who are telling me that they're overpaid. All right, most public servants, judges, district attorneys, assistant district attorneys will tell you, my market opportunities in the private market are much more lucrative than they are here. And that could be a problem. That can definitely be a problem if we're pulling from the wrong end of the distribution, in the sense that we're putting people in these jobs whose very job it is to discern whether or not you go to jail and we take your civil liberties away from you. We want to get the best people we can in those jobs. And when we've kind of tried to look at what happens when we change the wages for these people and bring them up to market wage, what happens? And as it turns out, judges get better. The bad ones end up getting outcompeted and they leave their jobs. Better judges come in, they make fewer legal errors. District attorneys get better. So, the private market and staying competitive with private market wages actually ends up being really important for criminal justice in terms of minimizing the number of legal errors. And the last thing I'll talk about is just criminal justice as a revenue generator. And I think this is one that we're all kind of aware of. Has anybody ever seen any of the YouTube videos by Judge Frank Caprio in Rhode Island? Has anybody seen any of these? Where it's really kind of fascinating. He'll have an individual standing in front of him and he'll say, this person's financially not doing all that well. And the last thing they need is to pay a $75 citation, which is going to leave them with $10 in their bank account to feed their family for the week. And so he'll say, this is just wrong, and I'm not going to do that. And that's counterintuitive just because many of us think about the criminal justice system as this revenue generator for the state, right? And to throw some numbers down, traffic revenues account for somewhere between $7.5 and $15 billion over the last 5 years. It's a huge amount of money. Possession of drugs, this isn't trafficking or anything else, it's just possession, makes up about $12.5 billion annually in revenues to the United States. A huge amount of money is generated through the criminal justice system. In addition, civil assets are seized on a regular basis, and that includes money, cars, homes, all sorts of stuff that raises revenues for the criminal justice system. Why does this matter? Because, I can think of a couple of reasons, but the list goes on. Locations that are fiscally stressed are going to probably use the criminal justice system as a mechanism for raising revenues. And you should be concerned about that for the second reason, which is probably that these will impose regressive taxes. We'll be placing taxes in the form of revenues that are being generated from the criminal justice system disproportionately on people who probably don't have the funds to pay for these revenues, for the revenue generation that the criminal justice system is imposing. So in a lot of ways, fiscal stress and all sorts of other pressures that other aspects of the government, that they're outlaying certain funds that need to be spent, but they don't necessarily have the backing for those expenditures, are going to start to rely on the criminal justice system. And that falls from the very top all the way down to the officer that's pulling you over. They're going to feel that stress. It wouldn't be the first time if an officer told me that they have heard and felt pressure to issue more citations because we need to raise more revenues. So there is definitely a bunch of extra legal pressures that are influencing the criminal justice system. So I hope I brought a couple of to your attention that maybe you hadn't thought about before, but I'm certainly looking forward to taking questions. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Professor D'Angelo. Professor Stevenson.
So how many people here have seen the movie Minority Report? All right, a good number of you. So for the ones that haven't seen it, it's a science fiction film, came out about 15 years ago. And in this movie, there are 3 mutated human beings. They're called precogs, who are able to see into the future. And they're able to predict that a crime is about to happen before it occurs. Now, these precogs are embedded in the criminal justice system, and when they see that a crime is about to occur, the police are notified, and they go out, and they make an arrest, and they stop that crime. Murder rates in this fictional world are close to 0, but the prisons are full of people that are being punished for crimes that they didn't actually commit. Now, of course, this is a fictional movie, but nowadays, the world is getting more and more science fiction. In courtrooms across the country, judges are using artificial intelligence to predict the likelihood that people are going to commit crime in the future. And on the basis of this evidence, they are making decisions such as whether or not the person's going to be held on high bail after they're arrested and before they're even convicted. Decisions such as how long a sentence they should receive, whether or not they should be released on parole, or if they are released, how much supervision should they be put under. So these are big, important decisions that have a lot of impact on people's lives. Now, the risk assessment is done by plugging a bunch of inputs into a prediction algorithm. These inputs include things like offense, criminal history, the person's age. They also include sometimes more controversial inputs, such as the education level that a person has, their employment status, the zip code they live in. Now, these inputs do correlate with future offending, statistically, but they're also direct socioeconomic markers and are correlated with race and poverty. The use of these inputs raise all sorts of ethical and legal issues. Do we as a society feel comfortable with punishing people more harshly because they're poor, because they're uneducated, because they come from certain zip codes? Even the less controversial inputs, such as the number of prior arrests in a person's criminal record, are also the subject of racially disparate practices. If you grow up in a heavily policed neighborhood, you're simply more likely to have prior arrests than if you had committed the same acts that many of us committed when we were 17, 18 years old, but happened to grow up in a more affluent neighborhood. So, on the one hand, the use of artificial intelligence to predict future crime and make life-altering decisions about people's freedom is kind of science fiction, and it's a little scary. But on the other hand, judges have been tasked with predicting future crime for a long time. It's one of the core things that they do as part of their job. Now imagine you're a bail judge and you've got somebody in front of you who's been arrested on a domestic violence charge. You need to determine, do I set bail low and let this person likely go home, or do I set bail high and keep them in jail? Now you're making that decision on the basis of your own internal prediction of how likely it is that if you let that person go home, they go home and they do something really horrible. You are predicting crime. So if we're already in the business of trying to predict crime, why not make it a little bit more formal? At least with these risk assessment algorithms, it's transparent. You know what inputs are being included in this decision and what inputs are not. Race, for instance, is an input that is not allowed to be used in these. So even though there's indirect ways that they embed racial biases, they don't have the same direct racism that many judges might have. Furthermore, if these risk assessment tools prove to be superior than human judgment, there's a lot of gains to be had from that. In one recent study, the authors claim that New York City could lower their jail populations by 43% without affecting crime by adopting their risk algorithm. Now, those are big, impressive numbers. If those numbers are true, we all need to sit back and think about it. You know, maybe we're comfortable with putting aside some of our qualms about this kind of science fiction-y type practice if we are going to be able to really get some real improvements in our criminal justice system. Now, these are big, complicated questions, and I don't pretend to have the final answer on any of them. As a society, we are just in the beginning process of reckoning about the impact that big data is going to have on our lives. And we are trying to consciously curate the way that we interact with big data to be able to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm that it might produce. The debate over what role computer-generated risk assessment algorithms should have in criminal justice is active and current, and I look forward to discussing these issues with you guys today.
All right, thank you. Professor Harvey.
Great, well thanks, and first thanks to the business school for having us here. It's great to be here. Thanks to Steve and Michael. So just to highlight a couple things that came out in Greg and Megan's comments, you know, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, there's really two margins we can push on. One is efficiency. Can we deliver public safety at a lower cost, where cost can mean not just the financial costs, the budget costs of, you know, what law enforcement and criminal justice costs, although that's important because it's our taxpayer money, but also the cost to individuals of losing their liberties for however long, whether, even if it's just a traffic stop, or it's a ticket, or it's an arrest, or it's incarceration. So people bear real costs through the criminal justice system, and we want to make sure that we're, we're getting the maximal benefit out of our institutions and practices with the lowest possible cost. The other margin we can push on is equity. So given some practice, are people being treated equally within that practice? Are likes being treated alike? And so, and both of those questions, like pushing on either of those margins, requires science. And so that's the kind of the common thing, the thing that's common to all of us up here is that we take the tools of social science and data science and apply them to these questions and try to come up with, better outcomes, right? And either efficiency or equity. And so the lab that I founded at NYU studies policing strategies. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the front end of the criminal justice system. We care a lot about incarceration, but in order to get to that point, right, there's a law enforcement action on the street somewhere. There's really two kinds of policing that happen. One is proactive policing. So that's when an officer is out using his or her discretion to make a stop, to make an arrest. In most places, they're traffic stops. Where I live in New York City, they're oftentimes pedestrian stops. And there's been a lot of concern about, who's being pulled over, what kinds of people are being stopped, what's happening when they get stopped. And we have a lot of concern, I think, throughout our society about racial bias in proactive policing. It turns out, that's one of the most pressing questions we'd like to be able to make some progress on. It's also one of the hardest. And it's hard in terms of the science. It's hard for the following reason. I want to know if an officer, given two cars that are driving exactly the same way, and one of them is being driven by a white driver and one of them is being driven by a non-white driver, I want to know that the officer behaves exactly the same, irrespective of the race of the driver. The problem is, I'm not the police officer, and I will never, as a scientist, I will never be able to observe what the officer sees when he or she is out there making stops, and they have discretion to make stops. So I know what I can see recorded in the stop form, or on an incident report, but it's never going to capture all the detail. And so trying to be able to isolate the effect of race of driver from all of the other things that an officer might see but I can't see turns out to be a really hard problem in terms of the science of it. And we can talk some more about that if that's something you guys are interested in, because there are some strategies that people have developed and we can talk about how far they've gotten. Another problem that might be more tractable in terms of proactive policing is maybe thinking about the efficiency. Like, is it actually buying us any reductions in crime or increases in public safety, making all of these stops? In New York City, the police NYPD had a practice known as stop and frisk, where they were making a lot of pedestrian stops. At its height in 2011, they were stopping approximately 700,000 kids. And I say kids because these were mostly young, non-white men. Aside from the question of the racial disproportionality, there was also the question of, well, what was it getting us? Were we making the city any safer? The stops have now declined under the pressure of litigation to an average of about 12,000 a year, and crime has continued to decline at the same steady rate that it was already declining at during the period of stop and frisk. So anecdotally, we worry that some of these practices are taking time and effort and resources and imposing costs on communities without really getting us any leverage in terms of public safety. Turns out that's also a hard science question because the stops are discretionary, and so I have yet to see a police department who will allow us to randomly assign stops across neighborhoods. I would love to do it. There was a place I wanted to do it. It hasn't happened yet, but that's the kind of science project we would need if we wanted to be able to figure out if stops were actually buying us any margin in public safety. So the policing lab doesn't really focus on proactive policing so much, in part because the science questions are harder there. And also in part because most of officers' time is taken up by what we call reactive policing, which is basically responding to calls for service. When you call 911, right? Somebody responds to your call, an officer responds to your call, and that takes up most of their time. And we have concerns about equity and efficiency, and reactive, responding to calls for service has gotten a lot less attention in the media than kind of what police are out there doing when they're roaming around making stops. But it's something that we've been focusing on. We think there are a lot of important questions we should all care about. And so just start with their equity questions. So I don't know if any of you remember the story of Tamir Rice in Cleveland. A call comes in to the Cleveland Police Department, and it's a guy sitting on a park bench. And he says, yeah, I'm sitting in this park, and there's a guy here, and he's got a gun, and he's pulling it in and out of his waistband and pointing it at people. And the operator says, and this is important because it's not an officer taking this call, it's a 911 call taker. The call taker says, what does he look like? And the caller says, well, he's got a camouflage hat on. And the call taker says, no, is he black or white? And the caller says, well, he's got a gray shirt and he's got black stripes on the shirt. And she says, no, is he black or white? And he says, sorry? And she says, this is the third time now she's asking, is he black or white? And he says, well, he's black. And then he says, but he looks kind of young. He's probably a juvenile. He's in a playground. The gun's probably fake. But he's pulling it in and out of his waistband. He's pointing it at people. I think somebody should come check it out. What gets entered into the CAD system, the computer-assisted dispatch system that officers actually see, is black male with a gun. And it's coded priority 1, which is the highest emergency priority a call can get. That tells the officers that they are in a dangerous emergent situation. It's lights and sirens. They have to get there in under 5 minutes. Their adrenaline is through the roof. The car pulls right into the playground, skids to a stop, 2 feet from the suspect, and within about 2 seconds, he's dead. And he was 12 years old, and it was a playground, and it was a toy gun, right? And none of that information made it into the prioritization of the call. So we know nothing about this. We know nothing about, was that just an isolated incident that, has never occurred since, and never will occur again, or is there the potential for calls wherein suspects' race is identified, that maybe call priorities get inflated? You could also imagine another kind of situation where it's a victim's race gets identified. Maybe, it's a kid and, my boyfriend beat my kid and he ran out of the house, and what does the kid look like? And what race is he? Well, he's black. Does that call ever get a lower priority rating than a similar call coming from an affluent neighborhood where the kid's white? So these are things that are happening at the very front end of the criminal justice system. When calls come in, they're being assigned priority codes subjectively by humans who have, as we probably all do, various biases and baggage that they bring to that. And the project that the lab has is kind of similar to some of what Megan was just talking about. We want to see can we do a better job assigning priority codes to calls if we could write an algorithm that pulled the information from the incoming call narrative, looked for any additional information about the address or the person or the phone number, and based on prior call history, assign a priority code to that call that doesn't use anything that's irrelevant or inappropriate, including the race of the suspect or the race of the victim. And without taking the human out of the loop, can we send an additional signal to officers that maybe is more appropriate to the situation? So that's one kind of project we're working on in terms of equity in calls. You also might think about efficiency in calls. So step aside from the equity question, are the priority codes that are being assigned to calls the codes that are optimally assigned in order to produce good outcomes, whether we're talking about risk of civilian injury, risk of officers' injury? Again, probably not, because these are humans sitting there with limited information. They don't have time to search all the databases of prior calls and prior cases that might involve that address or that person or that call. They're just hearing somebody saying something on the phone, and they're assigning it a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is then determining how fast officers get there, how many officers get there. It determines the deployment of law enforcement resources. So again, we're asking the question, can we start to build a predictive model based on prior call and case records that allows us to think about what are the optimal priority codes given the set of information that we have for an incoming call, and can we then assign those codes. And then finally, for officer safety, and this is just the last thing that I'll say, some of you might see in the news occasionally. There was one last week in South Carolina. There was one, I remember it was New Year's in Denver. Officers respond to a call, and it's a low priority call. It's like maybe a domestic violence call. And they don't know what's waiting for them. They think it's low risk. They think it's nothing to worry about. And they get there, and you've got 4 or 5 officers shot, maybe 1 or 2 fatally shot. Because what they didn't know was that somebody's in the house with a warrant, a gun, a prior history of calls, prior history of interaction with the police, pattern of escalation in the calls over time. None of that was known. Those are things that, again, we can take the tools of data science, computer science, social science, and start to help law enforcement agencies begin to build models that will allow us to push information to officers before they get to calls. So we might be able to improve the efficiency of the way that resources are allocated in call response. So those are just some of the ways that maybe frontline policing could be reformed in a better way, but I'm also happy, as we all are, to take any of your questions.
All right, thank you, Professor Harvey. So, Tamir Rice, 12 years old. Did his life matter? Respond. Did his life matter?
Yes.
Yeah, come on. Do we want that to happen in Louisville?
No.
No. So when you're thinking of your questions, think of them not purely as an academic question, but something which, can we take this and apply it here? We actually, after lunch, were talking about these things. We called down to some folks at LMPD, and they said, we'd like to talk. We think this is something we can pursue here. We don't know if we can or not, but maybe so. So, and this is the city you all live in, and this is stuff you'll take to cities you'll live in the future. So with that, who would like to be the first person to stand up and, feel the adrenaline rush as they ask a question?
And nobody's going to stand up.
All right. Yep, this gentleman here, you want to stand up? And your name, please, sir?
My name is Jose Fernandez.
Oh.
I will go to the microphone.
Well, excellent. I apologize.
My name is Jose Fernandez. I'm an associate professor of economics here. And so the question I have is, how do you, since we were talking about voting before, how does the felony account, which in some states removes the right to vote well after you've served your time, affect a lot of things? And how much of that could explain certain swing states and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be completely honest in saying that, we don't know the answer to this question at all. This is a fantastic question. It speaks to one of many of the civil rights that are stripped away from individuals that are incarcerated legally and illegally, right? Both in both situations. But certainly, I think that you're pointing to an important issue, because at first, when people think about, well, it's not that, we're just taking the right to vote away from individuals who are just incarcerated, and then you start to recognize, like, wait, that's a huge population of people, and how is that changing that marginal, that swing voter, right? I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there's 2 other very knowledgeable individuals, 3 other actually that maybe know this space, but I will point blank state that I know of no research that has examined that specific question and gotten to the core of it.
Florida's currently considering bringing 1 million new voters.
So in 2008, we elected our first black president. In that election, 1 in 8 black men could not vote because they were incarcerated or they had a felony in their criminal history. So first of all, that's a big number. That's a really big number. There has been some research on, but then again, a lot of marginalized people choose not to vote anyway. So there's been some research. So you can kind of ask like a short-term question and a long-term question. So if you gave the right to vote back, would these people immediately vote in the next election? The research tends to suggest that many of them wouldn't. You know, it would make some difference, but maybe not a huge one. But maybe the reason that marginalized people don't vote in elections is because they're marginalized and because the whole system doesn't have legitimacy for them for a variety of reasons, one of which is, you know, the sort of oppressive burdens of the criminal justice system that are borne by certain sections of the population. So if we had a system where they weren't marginalized in the same way, where they, you know, there was more legitimacy of our entire legal apparatus in their eyes, you know, then you this is kind of like a long-term type result, then you might see significantly more, a significantly larger increase in voting and a bigger shift in terms of, you know, the impacts on our elected representatives.
Good. Well, by the way, who do y'all think, since this may seem to be a political issue, who do you think would be more likely to support giving felons the right to vote, Democrats or Republicans? Democrats. So they've been trying for at least 30 years that I know of to do it in Kentucky and have failed. We get a Republican governor, and he gets the first partial re-enfranchisement bill passed in his first session. In fact, he has a criminal justice reform panel that actually agrees with all of my colleagues here. So there are a lot of surprises here. Don't take anything for granted. So we had a couple of people with questions. Yes, ma'am.
I need to use a mic.
Yes. Well, probably not, but.
But we're recording.
Ah, you're being recorded. So you all be careful and keep it clean. Keep it clean.
Well, then I'll ask permission if I can ask two questions. In terms of local, state, and federal systems, how do you rank them? I would say, well, who's the worst, and where would you start?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, this is I mean, a super complicated question. I work with law enforcement agencies, for example, at all levels that you just mentioned, and I have had, you know, very different experiences at each level with different agencies. You know, at the local level, I think they just face different pressures at different levels. And I think that's what leads to a lot of the difficulties that we observe in terms of, so for example, you think of federal agencies, talk about even just the agencies interacting with one another. It's very difficult, for example, to create dependable data for researchers at the federal level to produce, and say, for example, in the uniform crime reports that the FBI produces every year, because the interactions with state and municipal agencies is that a lot of the relationship there is a bit frayed. And so, you know, you see this kind of tension all throughout the system. So it's hard to isolate one as being better or worse than the other because they all face different types of pressures. And it makes it very, very difficult as a criminal justice researcher, I will say, to be able to understand the quality of the data you're working with unless you can get directly to the sources. So it's been my experience as of late that I tend to go directly to the agency that is collecting that information and work directly with them exclusively because I think the quality of the content and the information that I'm going to be gathering is going to be the highest. Now that shouldn't in any possible way say that I think the federal agencies are doing a good job because they're trying to, you know, consolidate a tremendous amount of information, and I know firsthand that trying to do that is just a terribly difficult task. So yeah, I don't know that I answered your question specifically, but hopefully I've shed some insight.
Thank you, ma'am. And Professor Harvey also made a great suggestion, which this gentleman presciently have followed. Why don't you line up by the microphones so we can move through this very quickly on your questions, and I don't miss you in the audience. So sir, please, tell us your name and what do you want to know?
My name is John, and I was wondering, what are institutes such as Louisville doing to encourage black people to get involved in law enforcement at every level, judges, lawyers, prosecutors, all that, as well as what is the university doing as far as trying to help with representation with people, you know, like downtown in jails or in prisons, because a lot of the times, like you had said about the caseloads and stuff like that. A lot of times if you're forced to get a public defender, for the most part, you're not meeting that person until like 10 minutes before you're about to go in front of the judge, and they're pretty much just going to go a textbook thing. They don't really care, or they don't really even have time to care about what's going to happen to you or try to get you the best deal. It's just pretty much cut and paste.
That's a question for you.
Yes. Well, some public defender offices around the country seem inadequate. Louisville is lucky. Some parts of Kentucky are fortunate in that they have pretty aggressive defense counsel in the defender's office, in part because they hate the prosecutors. And so giving them letting them run over their clients is kind of tough. That being said, there are, as far as I know, the university's not doing anything. But there are people in state government who are concerned about the problem. The Department of Public Advocacy, which runs the statewide public defender system, is aware that there are just the problems you've outlined. And what they have tried to do, they're doing two things. They're trying to conduct more intensive training, saying, look, don't just roll over on this guy. You know, file a few motions, find out if there's a case here, and then try and work the deal. The second thing they're doing, and this is causing some consternation, is exactly what our colleagues are doing. They're going into the data regarding the arrest, the charges, was there any pretrial activity defending this person, what's the outcome? And they are finding there are disparate outcomes, as you've mentioned, and they're going to people and saying, you got to stop this. We now have a report card on your performance, and you've got to step up your game. You have got to represent these people better. And there are indications that it is beginning to have an effect. But this is the issue of accountability, and how do you hold people accountable in a distributed statewide system without data? So, and I think, Dr. Stevenson, did you do some work on that?
I have done research on, so many of you, some of you may know that Kentucky is one of the earliest adopters of pretrial risk assessment tools. So these are the computer-generated algorithms that predict the likelihood someone's going to commit crime being used by bail judges. And so I've done a study on the use of these risk assessment tools here in Kentucky. And one of the things, and so in 2011, there was a law that was passed saying that judges are required to use these risk assessment tools and setting a presumptive default of release for all defendants that are ranked low or moderate risk. Now, this law came about because of the exploding jail population. It was written specifically with the intention of reducing jail numbers because, as was mentioned, they're very high in Kentucky compared to the rest of the United States, which is also high compared to the rest of the world. And what happened is not that much. Judges basically ignored this presumptive default of release more often than not. If they had followed it, something like 80 or 90% of Kentucky defendants would be released without being required to pay bail. Instead, only 29% were released without monetary bail. So, it's a complicated system. You have a bunch of different players that are facing their own set of incentives. Judges in Kentucky are elected, they're not appointed. So, I can imagine that some of them, might feel suspicious of this tool that's been given, might resent the sort of imposition of a law at the state level telling me what to do, and more importantly, might be concerned that if they make a mistake and they release the wrong person, that there's going to be blowback. That they're going to have the press coming after them. That they're going to lose the next election, and so this reform was not successful in lowering the jail populations at the way that they hoped. But they're continuing to revise and modify the way risk assessments are used, and some of the changes that they made recently, I can talk about it more if you want to, but I think have some real promise.
Okay, very good. Real quick, you're held in jail 2 days. What happens to your job? Yes, and think about everything that cascades from there. Professor D'Angelo, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think to piggyback off what Megan's saying, I think there's great promise in moving forward in the fact that I'm a big advocate for data opening up the pathway for solutions to some of these problems. And one of the ways I know Megan's working on, and I've kind of worked in this space a little bit more, is that it's such an odd time for somebody who's experiencing this process, the criminal justice system. If you've not been through it before, I can only imagine that it's scary and you don't really know what's happening next, and these people start talking to you and you kind of don't know who's helping you out and who's against you. And so one of the things that's actually becoming increasingly more common throughout this process, because as many of you may know, but if you don't, 95% of cases will never see a courtroom, right? They're pled out. A plea arrangement is set up between district attorney's office and your attorney, most likely. And so one of the things that's becoming more and more fascinating, we were talking about earlier today, is the fact that we have so much more information in a consolidated format that you can access more quickly. And so we're both kind of working on the development of tools that will enable individuals who are going through this process to have a little more of an expectation about what sort of a plea discount should I expect? What is the next step in this process? And I will say there is a tremendous amount of good research being done by high quality researchers working with indigent defense organizations to increase the quality of defense attorneys as well. So I'm happy to hear that it's excellent here in Kentucky. That is not the case in many states. And so there's been a lot of effort put, and it's continuing to be put in place to assist those who are going through this process who really don't have a solid advocate. And I think that those two things, more information and better advocacy, is what I see as the best possible step forward in terms of helping individuals who have been harmed greatly by this system.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, sir, over on this side of the building.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your time. My name is Jason. I'm an undergraduate psych major, and I'm a research assistant in decision making, which I'm sure you all know is very complicated. But following in the footsteps of the late Eleanor Ostrom, one of the things that's really shown itself over and over is the value of communication, direct communication, and the problems involved with layers of abstraction and getting people to cooperate and solve problems. So one of the things that I'm hearing, and that it kind of worries me, and maybe this is an unfounded worry, is a lot of statistics, Bayesian, utility theory, things that are very layer after layer of abstraction between the people involved. It would seem to me that maybe one of the best solutions is to actually have poor people, underrepresented minorities, people with criminal records who are directly involved in policy making, directly involved in discussing these matters at the top level, so that the people that make these rules and these decisions are not doing it based off of computer models and statistics, but after seeing what people actually are. Does that seem like a valid thing, or? Thank you.
Very humane.
Anna?
Yes.
Well, right. No, so, and thank you for that. It's interesting because, and these are mostly projects that Greg and I are working on together. Because I would also say you also have to talk to law enforcement. I mean, these are the people who are actually out there, responding to calls, making the stops, and you have to understand what they're thinking, because it's ultimately any tool or any kind of assist in decision making. They're the receivers of it, and so you have to. In fact, I would say, before, I would want to have everybody involved in the conversation, but the first people I'd want to talk to are people within the law enforcement agency itself, because nothing's going to go anywhere if they're not on board and they don't see the value. So we have spent a lot of time having a lot of conversations with officers and detectives and captains and assistant chiefs and chiefs about, is there a way that we can help you do your job better in the way that you see your job being done, while at the same time doing some of these other things that, for example, reducing racial bias and assignment of priority codes to calls, That can be something that, we don't walk into a law enforcement agency and say, hey, our #1 priority is to, stop you being so racist. We say, we're going to come in and we're going to help you promote officer safety, protect your officers when they're responding to calls. In the process of doing that, we're going to write an algorithm that explicitly prohibits, right, the use of information that is inappropriate and not related to outcomes. And so yes, I totally agree with you about there have to be humans informing this and using it and buying into it and using it. And then ultimately, if we can get law enforcement buy-in, then I think we go out to the community before it gets deployed and we start talking to community leaders and get their input too.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to add something on this. So there is a movement to bring community more involved in all levels with the criminal justice system. This movement is not huge. It is more deeply rooted in certain cities than in other cities, but community policing, for example, where an active part of reforming the way the city polices itself is by holding meetings between officers and the neighborhoods that they're charged with policing. So this happens in kind of formal ways, like I just mentioned, the formal meeting between the community members and the police officers, but this also happens in informal ways throughout the criminal justice system. I mean, the most classic example is the jury. We have a set of laws. We have in many places there's rules, there's mandatory minimums, there's this and that. And then what you have is you have a group of however many people that are sitting in a room that are making their own decision, and then sometimes they will try and, the phrase is nullify, like the academic phrase is nullify, but if they think a law is unjust, they will nullify it. They will refuse to convict somebody of something, even if maybe they did it because that they think the mandatory minimums are unfair. Or, for instance, they have, there's a new thing called community bail funds, which are kind of like nonprofit entities that are there to bail out people that are, like poor people that are held because they can't afford to pay just a small amount of bail, like $1,000 or $2,000. They don't pose a big risk. They're only charged with misdemeanors, but maybe they've got a couple misdemeanor arrests in the past, so the judge wouldn't let them go for free. And so, the community members come together and they say, okay, we're going to loan you this money, no interest rate, but you show up in court. And you know what? They do show up in court, which they have, like something like a 99% success rate with these things. And what this is this is a sort of informal process where the community members are getting involved and they're saying, this way that the criminal justice system is currently working, we think this is unjust. We're going to take our actions as community members and kind of overrule the bail judgment in a way, like let this person go free, even though the judge set the bail at a level that restrained them.
Real quick, a comment on that though, Professor D'Angelo. What's the risk if you try and bring this equity into the system? Political risk.
Of the political risks into the system. Well, from which standpoint? I'm interested to hear your perspective, where you want me to talk from.
Judge, the prosecutor.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So when you bring the political party affiliations and these sorts of things into the system, I mean, it complicates matters considerably. I mean, political affiliations are good and that they help us. Well, there's two sides of this, right? One side is that the political parties are helping us as uninformed voters try to figure out who is going to be the person that's best for us, is going to most closely align with our preferences. But on the flip side, going through the voting process can be a struggle, because if a judge is sitting and making determinations about who they should let go and who they should keep in jail, they should give a high bail to and a low bail to, turns out if they're facing political pressure during those time periods, that's where we see just some of the most egregious errors, mostly because they're starting to devote their time to other activities, namely campaigning activities. And so this can be really destructive to the system. So I do think the more that we can get community involved, I think it's pretty productive. I will say I have one example for you where it really speaks directly to your point, though. It takes away from what you asked me to talk about, but I work a tremendous amount on human trafficking. And the lifeblood of the tools that we are building and giving to law enforcement community to identify human trafficking victims comes specifically from trafficked individuals. And traffickers, for that matter. They are absolutely the lifeblood in ensuring that we can identify future victims and try to help them now. So I do think a lot of this is happening. it just isn't as sexy for the media to talk about. And so it's going on. It's just not, it's not in the forefront all the time, but there are some great examples of where it's occurring. I think we are only better from doing, through more of those developments. So I think you're onto something, and I hope we see more of it in the future.
Great. Excellent, thank you. This young lady in the back, yes?
Oh, you know what? I think it is.
Oh, well, then take it away.
Alexei Izumov, economics. It seems that all members of the panel share the liberal view, less arrests, low incarceration, and I would like to challenge you a little bit. I lived in New York in the 80s. Then the criminal situation there was terrible, and Rudy Giuliani approach, stop and frisk, minimum sensitivity to those political issues, and 8 years of that made New York into the one of the most safe cities. So it worked, and not only there, in other places as well. On the other hand, in the last 2 years, after effectively anti-police rhetoric in the media and from some politicians, we observe major increases in violent crime in many cities, such as Baltimore or Chicago. So how do you explain that? How will your recipes work in real life?
So I just want to counter your claim that what we're expressing is liberal views. I mean, criminal justice is a complicated area, and there's a lot of bipartisan support for the type of statements that we're making. I mean, I think everything that we have said could be echoed by the most libertarian organization or the Koch Institute, as well as the ACLU and the people on the left. So that being said, this increase in violent crime is something that is very concerning. I think we don't yet know where it's coming from. There have been a few cities with a really big increase in murder rates. There have been also lots of cities where the murder rate has continued to plummet. And the other thing that I want to say is, even though, for the most part, even though the murder rate has increased, it's still very, very small compared to where it was 20 years ago. So what we're seeing is a big plummet in the murder rate and then a blip up. So are we at a point yet where we can infer from that that's something related to the criminal justice reform movement that's been going on in the last couple of years? Probably that would be premature, but I think that it's certainly something that we all need to consider.
I was just going to say, so I came to New York after the 1980s. It was already pretty safe. But I think, that was the common inference, that crime started to decline when stops started to go up. And so everybody's like, oh, stops go up, crime goes down. Therefore, stops must have made crime go down. But then we stopped making all the stops, and crime continued to go down. And New York has not had the rise in violent crime over the last 2 years that some cities have had. And so as Megan said, it's kind of a puzzle, like what's going on in some cities. But anecdotally, it doesn't look like it's stop and frisk that was driving down crime in New York. I don't think we know what the effect of all those stops were, because there's so much selection bias in where the stops were made and who was stopped, and it's very hard to do science based on that, right? So I think it's more that we don't know, and I think we want to know, and we want to do more science, and we want to work with law enforcement agencies to get better data and to do more randomized controlled trials and get answers to those questions, because I don't know what the answer to the question is.
All right, good. Thank you very much. One last quick question. Yes, young lady. Yes, your turn. Sure. Yes, come on up.
Well, I'm an accounting major, and I have kind of a two-part question, just something that I'm kind of surprised I haven't heard addressed. Of our current jail prison population, how much of that is nonviolent offenders, as in drug offenses, marijuana possession, things of that nature? How much of that prison population is not people convicted of rape, assault, murder? And if you know that percentage, then I have a second question for you.
All
Oh, you want me to pinpoint a number down?
Who knows the number?
Ballpark it.
So
I'll take a ballpark.
I can tell you a few statistics. I can't exactly answer your question just off
No.
the top of my head, but I can tell you 1 in 5, we have got like 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. 1 in 5 of them are detained pretrial. So they're people that are presumed innocent, have not yet been convicted of anything. A little bit less than 1 in 5 are convicted and are there on a drug sentence. The other 3/5, you know, that encompasses everything from, you know, larceny to more serious crimes. So yeah, I don't know the exact population, but something less than 3/5. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. If you go online, Kentucky has released a report last month about this issue, and the governor's office and the Department of Justice for the state said we have got too many people locked up for nonviolent crimes. Part of the reforms they're looking at is what alternatives to incarceration do we use for them? And I believe they will have the statistics for you to follow, but it's a huge concern because prison space is so expensive.
Yeah. Well, they just arrested a person for 100 pounds of marijuana. That person is currently sitting in jail awaiting trial, and it would just be nice if we could find a better solution, whether these cases just never make it, period, or maybe they're dismissed. Something has to be done about this. You know, Portugal has decriminalized everything. They've turned their criminal justice system into a rehab system instead, and it's difficult to understand why this is why we can't do this in the United States.
That's an excellent point, although 100 pounds.
Yeah, I agree. It's not medicinal, but still, it's relatively unharmful, as many studies have already confirmed.
I mean, one reason I think Greg pointed to earlier, you know, what is it? Drug possession arrests bring in something like more than $12 billion in funding. So, you know, there's.
Yeah.
Contributing to GDP, doesn't that produce more revenue than keeping somebody in jail?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Yes. I would say, and you're pointing to things that the three of us and many others have been kind of saying is, you know, there's this, you know, this issue of, I remember as a little kid driving by a correctional facility and asking my mother, what are they correcting? Right? And I, you know, it was just like, and I was probably destined to be on this path from that day. But, you know, but I've been around lots of people who are from other countries and who have decriminalized, you name it, prostitution, all sorts of things, and they've seen significant actually increases in lots of margins that we care about, like health and the safety of the individuals who are involved in the process. And in those same countries, going to prison there, you would never consider it prison. It sort of looks like probably some of your dorm rooms.
Like Norway.
And it's more about talking about like what's taking you down that path, interacting, you know, having group sessions, talking about decisions and life choices that have been made. And it you know, it seems like it's pretty good. And there's tremendous amount of research that actually does show that putting people in prison actually ensures that they're going to be on a path of a life of criminality from that point forward. It basically hardens them. So you're onto something. The questions are great. The political incentives, and what we call public choice in economics, is such that there's revenue associated with this, and people want something done, and they love the instantaneous gratification. And if somebody's done something and it's harmed me just a little bit, I want justice, right? And justice for most people seems like lock them up and throw away the key.
That's not justice, though. That's
it's
revenge.
Not at all.
Right.
I agree. I totally agree.
Perfect. I want to thank thank you guys for coming. I want to thank our panel.
Oh, that's great.
The most brilliant panel I've ever worked with.
Oh, thank you.
What do we got?